have a paper on it, but it's not doesn't really
It's not yet.
it doesn't really solve the address this problem.
Hello. Hello, is this working? Hi. Is it okay? And now for something completely different. Anyways, where is this vision? We have now, as I said, to put the economists in their place. We brought a pure unidentified philosopher to this event, and that's Professor Akeel Bilgrami. Some of you may know him as a Sidney Morgan Bresser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. Distinguished career. He did his work as a philosopher at Oxford, and then at Chicago you were at, right? And then spent a lot of years at Columbia University. He was head of the Damon Center for Humanities, director of the Sidney Morgan Bresser Professor. And Akeel, just to sort of grab it, as I said, he and I have a long-standing connection. We go back several generations, it turns out. The point is the story about Sidney Morgan Bresser, the chair that he has, which he was just telling me. He said there was some Austin philosopher at Oxford who went to give a lecture at Harvard, was reported to have said, curious thing about English, a double negative is a positive, but a double positive is not a negative. And Morgan Bresser, sitting at the back of the room, supposedly said, yeah. So I thought I'd share that story. You know the topic of Professor Bilgrami, it's all on the program. And he's, as I said, going to give us something quite different, something to think about in an exercise, cells of our brain which have not been exercised that much. In the kind of stuff we do. Akeel.
Yeah, well, it's not entirely, I'm not entirely an interloper because I'm going to speak eventually about the first principle in Rawls. And we were speaking earlier about basically the possibilities of extrapolating the second principle in Rawls to global reach. So my question is, why does liberalism, liberal doctrine, find it so hard to cope with the concept of identity? Primarily as it surfaces in identity politics, but my interests are conceptual and not in the actual politics, but the interest in the concept of identity, of course, is motivated because it fuels identity politics. There are many answers to the question, why does liberal doctrine find it so hard to cope with identity? There's a kind of philosopher called the communitarian who has raised questions about liberalism's universalism. And there are a number of other answers, all of which are familiar and interesting. But what I want to present is some thoughts I've tried to develop which have not much to do with how community or particularity poses a problem for liberal universalism. I'm going to take that debate for granted and try and convey to you why I think that the deeper issues, that sounds self-congratulatory, why I think there is another set of issues which have to do with the clash of mentalities between liberalism and those who have made identity central to their political mobilizations. But I'm going to begin, before I get to politics, with some frameworking which has to do with practical reason, what philosophers call practical reason, which is primarily got to do with a broadly understood framework of decision theory, but I'll present it in purely philosophical terms. So I'm going to begin with practical reason, and I'm going to spell out 3 notions for you first. These are what I'm going to call reinforcement, weakness of will, what Aristotle called akrasia, and the third is identity. Can you see this? Reinforcement, weakness of will, and identity. So I'm going to spell out these 3 notions, which will set up an apparatus that I want to exploit in talking about politics. Reinforcement is a term I've coined. Actually, I'm not happy with it, so if any of you suggest another term, I'd be grateful. And I'm going to try and define that by first just saying a word or two about what I mean by practical reason. Practical reason was first defined by Aristotle, and the idea is that we have conative states, which Aristotle, in translation, called desires, and so did Adam Smith and Hume, but which social scientists call subjective utilities or preferences and so on. So those are conative states, and then there are cognitive states, such as beliefs. And basically that's a distinction between normative states of mind and descriptive or cognitive states of mind. And the standard idea is that you have certain wants or desires or preferences, and then you have certain beliefs about what will satisfy them. and that motivates you to act along certain lines. So if you have the preference to quench your thirst, and you believe this bottle of water contains something that will quench your thirst, then you drain this bottle of water, and so on. So that's Aristotle's idea of a practical syllogism. And decision theory basically refines that idea by adding degrees of belief, probabilities, and degrees of subjective utility, and refines it and axiomatizes it, and so on. But we don't have to get into those details to basically define the concept. I'll just work with a notion of desires or preferences, and I'll hold the belief steady. That is, I'm just taking it for granted that the beliefs are all things being equal to be held steady. And I want to argue that there is a relationship between these states, which is a relationship of reinforcement, and this relationship is a rationality-inducing relationship. And I think it is an absolutely essential rationality-inducing relationship which is relevant to politics. So I'm going to define it by giving you a pair of desires or preferences and asking you to intuitively observe a deep difference between them. Philosophers have tended to, and economists have tended to think that there are 2 kinds of basically rationality-inducing relations between states of mind. One are relations of logic. Consistency is the central one. And the second is means end, or instrumental reasoning, right? And so Adam Smith and Hume defined these two as the hallmarks of rationality in the practical sphere. So here are two pairs of desires. Pair A, so this is my autobiography here. So I have the preference. I'm going to use the old-fashioned term. I desire that I drink tea every morning. I desire that I drink tea every morning. That's A1. And I desire that I do philosophy. Now, this pair of desires is perfectly consistent in my case. I hope in your case too, if you had them. And all that consistency means is mutual implementability. Right? That's really, consistency is a completely uninteresting rationality-inducing relation because it just means, so there's nothing interesting that relates these two. They're consistent, and if you possess these two desires, it's very likely, since you can mutually implement them, that they're consistent and you're rational in that sense. Here's the second pair of desires. I desire that I drink tea every morning. No, I got it wrong. I desire that I do philosophy. And I desire that I please my father. Now, I should just tell you a bit of autobiography. My father was a judge. He admired the intellectual life, and he was very keen that I pursue it. Okay? So now, given that background, there is prima facie here, these are consistent, but they seem to be something more than consistent. Right? Given what I've just said. So this is merely consistent. This is more than merely consistent, given the kind of man my father was and his hopes for me and so on. Right? These desires, I'm saying, have this further property of reinforcement. Okay? They reinforce each other. I don't like the word reinforcement because it suggests something hydraulic or causal. I really mean mutual rational support. Okay, but I don't really have, that's too many words, so I need a single word. So, now, what Hume and Adam Smith, their legacy, what they would insist is, well, okay, you're right, but all this means is that there's this means-end relation between them. There's an instrumental form of rationality between them. Right? Now, what is instrumental rationality? What is it for there to be a means-end relation between two desires or two preferences? The only criterion I can give you is that I pursue one desire in order to pursue and fulfill the other desire. So it's an in order to relation. That's all it could mean. What else could it mean? So it will be said by the standard picture of rationality, which says there's only consistency and means end, that this desire is is the end, and I pursue this desire in order to pursue this desire. Right? I pursue philosophy in order to pursue the preference of pleasing my father, right? To fulfill the preference of pleasing. So they'll say, nothing, what's this reinforcement? It's just good old means end. Well, no. I did not pursue philosophy in order to please my father. It's just a fact about me. You know, when it comes to fathers, you could be self-deceived, but just believe me, I did not pursue philosophy in order to please my father. I just didn't. But I'd have these two desires. I have both these two preferences. I did not do one to pursue the other. So reinforcement does not collapse into means end. It's a self-standing third form of rationality-inducing property, relational property between preferences. And I think it's extremely important to stress it because it is a subtle and pervasive property between connative states, between preferences, which makes us more and less rational. And it is, I think, a preposterous simplicity and narrowing to restrict rationality amongst preferences to just means end and consistency. There just is this third rationality-inducing relation. Now, the opposite of this relation, so consistency has as its opposite inconsistency, so we need another term for the opposite of reinforcement, and I don't know, I've sometimes used the word the infirming relation. One infirms the other, or something like that. But anyway, that's the idea. The idea is this consistency and inconsistency. You can get wrong the means to your ends, and you can have an infirming relation between, just as you might have a reinforcing relation. Okay, so that's reinforcement. All right? Now, the second concept is weakness of will. And, you know, the popular slogan which defines weakness of will is knowing the better and doing the worse, right? So I'm having my fifth martini and I say, I ought not to be doing this as I do it. You know, so that's weakness of will, right? You know the better, but you do the worse. Your will doesn't follow your rational judgments, etc. So I'm going to just define weakness of will in terms of reinforcement by saying one is weak-willed if one's reinforced desires suggest that one should be doing X, but one does not X. Right, Y, which is inconsistent with X. Okay? So that's weakness of will. The rationality of our most reinforced desires suggests the rational action is X. I do Y. That's what I mean by weakness of will. Okay, so then the crucial concept of identity. Now, the notion of identity I'm interested in this primarily because it's what mobilizes one in politics, is the idea, you see, they're objective identities, identities that are just given to one. You know, philosophers like Foucault and Hacking and so on have suggested that everything is constructed, so nothing is given, and I'm not going to get into those issues. But the idea here is that if you define gender identity via chromosomes, that's just a given identity, right? It's not, or if you define national identity by birth, that's also just given, or passport or something like that. It's objective. But subjective identity is not. Amartya Sen uses the word chosen. I don't think it's all that that's too voluntaristic. I think the right term for the kind of identity you have in mind, which is not objective, is identity that endorses some property that one possesses, objective property that one possesses, subjectively. So somebody who's African American, say, if he or she endorses her African Americanness and mobilizes herself in politics, well, that's the notion of identity that's relevant to politics, not just the objective racial. Okay, so that's the notion of identity. It's, as it were, identity as self-conception. This is what I take myself to be. Okay.
Objective identities are
Well,
immutable?
they die, immutable within a lifetime, right, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you can have sex changes and so on, but other than that. So, I mean, you can change your passport and so on, but it's given by something objective. So it's not immutable in that sense, but it's given by objective factors of that kind.
Sorry, not clear what's the difference between identity in this sense and the sense of subjective.
Well, Sen uses the word, you choose your identities. I don't like that, because what I think you do is you endorse objective things that are given to you. If that's what you mean by choice, it's fine. I mean, I can't choose to be an African American, so.
Sen's point was not so much, you have multiple identities. Which particular identity relevant in a particular context
is what you endorse, I'm saying. I don't like the word choose because it suggests more voluntarism than is actually the case. You see, it might, you might, I think when there's a real politics of resistance, it's possible that you can really choose something. You know, there was an interesting moment when Salman Rushdie, when the Satanic Verses came out, the Penn Society, in its most rabid moment, came out and had a meeting. And Norman Mailer declared in the meeting, I am Salman Rushdie. Do what you will to me, he said, you know, to the Muslims. Well, that's something that is chosen, but is not endorsing anything property that. Do you see? That's ultra-voluntarism. There's a wonderful reply by Bernard Levin, the conservative English critic, who said, the flesh is willing, but the opportunity is weak, he said. All right, so I'm interested in that endorsed identity, and you know, it's sometimes said that an endorsed identity has to be pretty intense to mobilize you in politics, but I think the idea of intensity is not a very tractable, theoretically tractable notion. So I have, for some time now, been trying to make rigorous the concept of identity, partly because of the sorts of skeptical things that Sen and all have said about how it's all a mayhem of multiple identities and we shouldn't stress any over the other too much and so on. Well, here's how I'm going to try and characterize it, which I've done in some writing. I read a very fascinating thing by Ayatollah Khomeini some years ago, in which Khomeini said, you know, modernity is so pernicious and travels so fast and affects and influences so much that it's bound to affect us Ayatollahs too in Iran. But we shouldn't allow it to do it. We shouldn't allow identity to, modernity to affect us. So we should entrench our Islamic values in such a way that even if modernity does infect us, if we entrench in Islamic values, we would still be living by Islamic values even when we have weakened and given up on them. Now, that's, I think, a very theoretically pregnant remark. You shouldn't be put off by Khomeini's, by the fact that it comes from Khomeini and it has this Islamist element. I think it's a theoretically very fascinating remark. Here's why. You see, if I have a certain preference and I have it very intensely, it can't be the source of identity or my self-conception, because mere intensity is shallow. That is to say, somebody who's a cocaine addict, right, and has a very intense preference for cocaine may actually hate his addiction and not at all endorse that feature of his. So mere intensity can't be, because one is alienated from one's own preferences in that case. So the intensity is there, but it's not one's self-conception, right? So intensity is shallow in that way. Khomeini's remark is not shallow, because what is certainly true is that we're getting close to identity if I have a certain preference and I have a second-order preference to have that preference, right? So if I desire to live by Islamic values, right, and then I go to second order and say, that's a good desire to have. That's endorsement, or choosing, if you like. I mean, that's that arcane distinction we can drop now. So that endorsing or choosing seems to be what, so intensity at the first order is not insufficient. You have to choose, you have to endorse, you have to prefer your first order preference. That's the second order preference. But you see, even that's insufficient. So let me give you an example. I was in politics many years ago in this country. I went off to America very disillusioned, and for about 5 or 6 years, I just was extremely apolitical. And I shunned at the second order my first order political preferences, to be political. But I realized that the second order preference was irrational. That is, it was just too much part of me to have an interest in politics. And it's the second order preference which was not really, me, if we're talking about identity, right? So it's insufficient to just say one should go to the second order. What's deep about Khomeini's remark is that it's not just at the second order. So what is Khomeini saying? What Khomeini is saying is, look, I have the preference for Islamic values so strongly now that if I were to imagine that I didn't have them, I wouldn't recognize the person I was. Right? Remember, E.M. Forster said somewhere, I wouldn't recognize myself if I betrayed my friend or something like that, right? Something like that. Well, the idea is that if you imagine you are somebody who doesn't have these desires which are identity constituting, then that imagined person, you would say, is somebody else. It's not me, I would say, because I have such a deep commitment to the particular preferences that constitute my identity. So think of it. Really what's going on here is what philosophers like Jan Elster and all describe as Ulysses and the Sirens. Right? What Ulysses did was, well, who knows what Ulysses exactly is. There are about 5 different readings that I've come across of the great book, but let's just make up a story, okay? So Ulysses has a very deep commitment to family, fidelity, okay? He knows that the sirens will sing tonight, so he ties himself to the mast. Right? That's how deep his commitment, his preference for family, fidelity, etc. is. It's so deep that knowing that there will be scenarios, just like Khomeini, knowing that modernity will weaken one, etc., knowing that the siren song will weaken one, etc., one is so deeply committed to fidelity or Islam or whatever it might be, that knowing that, we entrench ourselves. We tie oneself to the mast. So that even at a time when one is given up on fidelity because we're so seductive, the sirens, or given up on Islam because modernity is so seductive, or whatever, one is still living by them, Islamic values. So here's what I mean by identity, and I think it captures the depth of commitment or preference which constitutes one identity. The idea is that at time t1, I'm only defining it at time t1, so it's not immutable. At time t1, I hold a preference in such a way that if I imagine, or if I suspect, that at time tn, I will lack that preference, I entrench myself at time t1 to those values in such a way that when tn comes along and I don't have those values anymore, I'm still living by those values. That's how I feel at time t1. That's serious commitment. If you have preferences that way, you rightly can be called as having a certain identity, because you will say, if I were to be that, I wouldn't recognize myself. Therefore, I'm going to make sure that I'm never that. Even when I want to be that, I'm living by this. That's how deep that commitment is at this time. And that's all I'm defining it at time t1. So you can actually have mutability of identities and commitments. They can change. I'm only defining it here. Here it's held with such depth that it's identity constituting. So I define identity in terms of preferences that are held in this Ulysses in the Siren's way, tying yourself to the mast. That's deep. I wouldn't recognize myself if I didn't have this. Make sure that I'm this even when I weaken, etc. Okay. So those are my 3 frameworking conceptual apparatus elements. Okay? Yeah.
So, just to clarify, so there's nothing like collective or political in the definition of identity. It seems like it could be like hiring a personal trainer would satisfy your definition of identity here.
Yeah, right. But I mean, yeah, like anything that's conceptual and philosophical, I give a general definition, and then when it applies to politics, only particular things are of interest. But that's just.
Trainer thing then does fall
Yeah, I mean, you could have a political movement for personal trainers. It would be eccentric as hell, but I'm not interested in ruling out eccentricity. I'm just interested in giving the conceptual apparatus by which to understand these things.
It does seem strange that there's nothing about it being social in its definition.
So add auxiliary things. Say it must be important socially and so on. I'm working at a level of abstraction. You're happy to add things so that it becomes relevant to. But those would be auxiliary things. I'm just giving you the framework that I'm going to exploit. Okay.
The hallmark of identity is the fact that you incur a cost.
Exactly. That's right. You tie yourself to the mast. That's the cost. Yeah. But that, the reason why it's got to do with identity is it shows the depth of your commitment. When a preference is held, if I hold my Islamic values with that strength, that not just intensity, but with this looped counterfactual Ulysses and the Sirens things, it reflects the sort of thing Forster says. I wouldn't recognize myself if I was that other thing. That's why I do this.
Maybe this is sort of trivializing or whatever, but I'm just wondering, because surely that's a continuum. Where does one, when is strong enough? When is the cost high enough for it to constitute an identity? What sacrifice does it take for it to become an identity? Because anything that's meaningless at some degree.
Well, tying yourself to the mast is pretty strong cost, right?
Yeah, but I'm just sort of saying that even analytically, how we, thinking of this tying down to the mast. What are the masts? What are the
Family life, fidelity, and all are identity constituting values of Ulysses. For Khomeini, Islamic identity, understood in terms of living by Islamic values, etc., broadly speaking. That's what I'm trying to capture. What is Islamic identity or Muslim identity? Well, you can see I just intensely feel about Islam. I'm trying to give a little more rigor to it.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that are we sort of just exposed, giving it when we already know it in some sense that it's identity. We are working back to now saying, what it is. Because I mean, in some way, saying what Suresh is saying. I mean, if I say that I'm going to give up pizza for lunch, is that enough of a cost?
Look, you can have incredible, if take any of you can have trivial identities. When it comes to politics, it's very unlikely that trivial identities will be in play. So then we get interested in the less trivial identities and the more political ones. I'm just giving you a conceptual structure. When you apply to politics, things like Islam will come in, probably not. Dietary things and so on. But who knows? In America, there's such an emaciated aesthetic that it might be a political thing. Yeah. Exactly. Very good. At time t1, I'm focusing on the preferences, and exactly right. And I'm tying myself to the mast, and so it's defined entirely at the earlier time, identity. Identity for Khomeini at time t1. That's all I'm defining. In terms of preferences, nothing else. Exactly right. That's great. Yeah. That's right. Right.
I wonder what you think about the problem that a person has, let's say, a deep identity as a member of a family, but also a deep identity as a member of a profession. Then at 5 o'clock each night, there's a question: do I go home to my family, or do I have to take to my work?
Sure.
And it's not 0-1 really, because you could go home in 10 minutes, in 2 hours, in 3 hours. And so what's interesting to me, and I discuss with people here, is the notion that the context determines which identity.
Absolutely.
You have multiple selves, and they're very sensitive to the environment in which you are, and therefore aggregate choices of others.
Excellent. Now pursue that thought and stress the contextual thing and say there are certain contexts, maybe political contexts at particular historical times, in which somebody will say, yeah, I have all those identities. I'm going to stress this one. I'm going to mobilize on this line because in this historical context, this is primary. That's it. It's a good thought that there are all these things, but certain contexts, some surface and take on maybe this Ulysses and the Sirens-like thing, and that's what I mean by identity.
So it's really, if you
context.
What other people are doing, which one comes to the fore?
Yeah, if other people influence you to think that this is primary for you and important. Yeah. Okay, so I've got quite a lot to get through. So I'll take questions, but I'd like to finish the argument and then. Okay, so those are the three concepts. And so now politics. I'm going to. So can you see this board? Yeah? Okay. So liberalism has a very familiar and very honored dictum, slogan. And it says, what does it say? It says, so we are citizens, right? So we are individual citizens must be left unimpeded. To pursue, and now there's a shifting rhetoric. Some people say their conceptions of the good life, but let's just say there's substantive values. So substantive values are things like Islam, socialism, or, there could be very specific things like a life in dance or theater or whatever, right? It could be very doctrinal, ideological things. It could be specific things and so on. So these are substantive values. And there's a general understanding that individual citizens must be left unimpeded too. Now, what's absolutely central to liberalism is that this dictum really has a very strong divide here because it mentions these values, but this value for liberalism, which let's call non-interference, is sort of fundamental. It's very basic, right? And it's the hallmark of liberalism that this value is very different from these values. I mean, you're not a liberal if you don't make a deep distinction between this value and these. Right? And one way to put it is that you can't weigh this value on the same scale as this value. It's just set apart in some way. And if you don't believe that, then you're not a liberal. It's just, I don't know what you are, but you're certainly not a liberal. Now, if that's right, what's fascinating is that classical liberalism, the sort of thing that is exemplified by Rawls's theory of justice, but it goes back at least to Locke. Classical liberalism, or even more strongly to John Stuart Mill, classical liberalism has not merely said that this value can't be weighed on the same scale as these values. It's set apart from these values as something special. But it says something further, which is that you can't justify this value, can't legitimate this value on the basis of these values. Okay? And that goes very deep in liberal thought. The idea here is that these values are variably held. You may be a Muslim and I may not be. You may value theater, I might not, etc. Right? And if something so defining of the polity is justified on grounds that are so variably held, then it becomes very unstable, etc. Right? It just doesn't have the weight of justification that's needed. So you can't, these can't be the basis for establishing this. So substantive values can't justify the defining liberal value. And you'll find this in John Stuart Mill's argument, say, for free speech. You know, the famous argument, the meta-inductive argument, where he says, we've all been, I'll put it down here. I'll go through this quickly. Mill says that the two premises, he says, first premise is, we've been wrong in the past. So we may be wrong now. I'm just doing this very informally. So let's adopt the policy of non-interference in speech and have free speech or tolerance. This is the conclusion, premise one, premise two. This is the conclusion. Why? Because we may be wrong now. So now what's fascinating about Mill's argument is that it captures the liberal thing because it doesn't mention any moral or political values in the justification for free speech. It merely makes appeal to induction. Everybody possesses the capacity for induction. I mean, unless they're brain damaged, or unless they're less than 2 years old or 3 years old, who knows when induction starts. So all adult, undamaged minds possess the capacity for induction. So it's not variably present in people. So if you can justify non-interference in speech, let's stick to speech, okay, since it's so central to liberalism. If you can justify it on an argument like that, you've got liberalism. Right? That's why it's a very deep commitment in liberalism. You must justify it on grounds that are stable, that are not variably held. Now, I think this argument, which probably many of you think is a knockdown argument, is a grotesque fallacy, but it's I'm not going to be able to convince you of that in a short period of time. It's just too hard because it really involves epistemic questions about the nature of truth and what it is to have hold true views and claim to have truths and so on. But let me just unsettle the conviction you might have in the validity of this argument by pointing out to you that this judgment here, see, over here we're being told to hold our judgments in the present with diffidence in case we're wrong, right? So, but notice that this judgment here, we're wrong in the past, is a judgment made from the current point of view, right? Now, if the current point of view is something that we're just diffident about, to that extent, the premise is something we should be diffident about. The whole thing is a mess. So there's just real internal difficulties, actually deeper difficulties with it, which I won't get into now, which we can talk about later if you like. But I don't think I can convince you about how consequentially it is wrong. That is how, I think it has serious consequences. The president of my university declared that Middle East departments should believe in Mill's argument and give the Israeli side on every matter if they are ever critical of Israel and say something in favor of the Palestinians. They must, it's a marketplace of ideas, you should hold your views diffidently, so on. Well, I'm sorry, I don't hold my views about the brutalization of the Palestinian people diffidently. I have no diffidence about my judgment about that. And I refuse to be made diffident by some million argument of this kind. So I just don't think that it's the right epistemology for that Mill is asking us to be committed to, but it has these consequences that you must show balance in the classroom and so on and so forth. Okay, but I'm going to skip Mill and present to you what is really there in Mill, but in a contractualist setting that is Rawls. Okay. So here is Rawls, which I'm going to just read Mill into Rawls because it's there. It's just in a contractualist setting. So Rawls's theory of justice has as its basic goal to come up with a method such that if you applied the method, you would choose principles to live by that cannot possibly be biased in your own favor. See, that's the chief underlying goal of the book, of the great book. It's a noble work, a noble aspiration. Come up with a method such that were you to apply the method, you would choose principles to live by which could not possibly be biased in your own favor. That's justice as fairness. Now, in order to do this, celebrated, all of you know, he asks us to imagine a state of nature, which is, for him, a state in which you do not know your own substantive values. Actually, what you don't know is your substantive position in life and so on and so forth, but that means you don't know your substantive values. It's screened off from you. You're ignorant of them by the drawing down of this veil. So these are blinded. You're epistemically blinded, these. And Rawls claims that if you apply his method, you will choose, apart from the things that Ravi was talking about earlier, the second principle, you will choose the first principle of liberty as well. So Rawls is a liberal in the required sense. You will choose the principle of liberty, non-interference. Let's stick with speech, without any appeal to these things, because these things are not available to you. Right? Now, when Rawls said this, there was this infantry that was unleashed on him by people like Stephen Lukes and then Michael Sandel and all the communitarians and so on. And they said, what are you talking about? Because what Rawls had said is, if you apply my method and you put this veil of ignorance, then you will be given the following instruction. Behind the veil of ignorance, you will be told, no matter what you imagine yourself to be when the veil is lifted, you will choose this principle to live by. No matter what you imagine yourself to be. This is important because Rawls rules out gambling. Right? He absolutely rules out gambling. So you can't say, oh, it's so unlikely that I'm going to be an impoverished person. Well, it depends on where you live, but you don't know where you live. But you don't know where you live, right? So let's say I'm going to take the risk that I'm not going to be absolutely impoverished. So I'll choose a certain principle to live. I'm going to take a risk of this, that, and the other. And so I'm going to, and Rawls is absolutely clear, no gambling. Why? He's basically risk averse. He wants, the whole idea here is that you have this hypothetical contract, but then you when the veil is lifted, you have an actual contract, and he's absolutely clear that in the actual contract, you must be able to live wholeheartedly with what you've consented to and contracted to in the hypothetical contract, which if you've gambled and lost, you will not. Right? So it is absolutely clear. The goal is that you will choose something in the hypothetical contract that in the actual contract you will be able to wholeheartedly live with. That's why gambling is ruled out. It's risk averse, no matter what I imagine myself to be. Right? Okay. So all this chorus of protests said, how on earth could you conclude from your own setup that you would choose this principle? I mean, if I'm behind the veil of ignorance, remember the instruction is no matter what you imagine yourself to be. If I imagine myself to be a devout Muslim, right, why on earth would I choose the principle of liberty? Because, you know, suppose there is this brash, Bombay-born, rugby-educated novelist who writes this novel trashing my most cherished beliefs. I want to censor him, to say nothing of kill him. Right? So what is Rawls talking about? He says, no matter what I imagine myself to be, I'll choose the principle of liberty. Why on earth would I choose it if I imagine myself to be a devout Muslim? So this was the protest. Stephen Luke started it, Sandel, the whole infantry. Okay. Rawls replied, he says, haven't you read my book? What I clearly said was that behind the veil of ignorance, I'm not allowed to know these values, or, you know, the substantive psychology, but I'm perfectly allowed general psychological knowledge of human beings. And Rawls says, we all know about ourselves that we change our minds and revise our beliefs and commitments and preferences. It's a general truth. It's a general, as he puts it, moral psychological truth. That we know we are the kinds of creatures who change our mind. That's allowed behind the veil of ignorance. I'm only not allowed this sort of thing. Right? I'm allowed to know general truths about human psychology and so on, moral psychology. So I know people change their minds. So I would certainly choose free speech because, you know, even if I imagine myself to be a Muslim, I can also must know that I might not be one day, and so I would want to choose free speech. So he says, you haven't understood the first thing. Okay? Good. So we now have a Rawlsian argument for free speech. But now notice, so I'm going to bring the practical rationality points down with this, but notice that Rawls is telling us that we should choose free speech because we want to take out an insurance policy for our future revised states of mind. By the way, Rawls is what Mill means by fallibility, right? I might be wrong, is just revisability in Rawls in the contractual situation. Right? So all that Rawls has done is given a temporal indexing to Mill's fallibility and made it revisability over time. Right? I could be wrong, I could change my mind. That's the only difference in a contractual situation. Okay, so notice that Rawls is saying, take out an insurance policy for your future revised states of mind against your present commitments. But if I'm right, the concept of identity is saying, take out an insurance policy for your present states of mind against the future, revised states of that is the real, that's the real difficulty for liberalism that comes from identity. It's, okay. So Rawls's counter-argument to the protest against his view was, we've got this general knowledge that we might change our minds, revisability. So we take out an insurance policy. The reason why we choose liberty of speech anyway is because we take out an insurance policy for our future revised states of mind, right? Even if I imagine myself to be a Muslim. So you take out an insurance policy for the future states of mind against the present states of mind. Whereas the way I characterized the depth of identity is that you take out an insurance policy for your present deep commitment. Hmm? Yeah. You take, yeah. Yeah, but you've changed your mind at a later point of time. That's how Ulysses... No. Ulysses is seduced. He just isn't... Ulysses changes his... He desires the sirens. He just can't do anything about it because he's tied himself to the mast. Right? And Khomeini is saying, for all I know, I might become one of these louche. Right? So he's basically... They're taking out an insurance policy for the present commitments against the future states of mind, which is the exact mirror opposite of what Rawls's argument for free speech is. That's the clash of mentalities. I think it goes one step deeper. It goes one step below all the community stuff. This is the real difficulty of what the concept of identity poses for liberal doctrine. Now, you might think, look, this is just an impasse. You haven't shown more than the difficulty of an impasse. Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. My sense is that, in fact, if this is what it is to be a liberal, the identitarian always wins. Because, you see, now bring in the notion of reinforcement. If I imagine myself behind the veil of ignorance, to be not just a devout Muslim, but have my Islamic values highly reinforced by all my other values, right? Then in order for it to be a mere impasse between Rawls would have to say, well, I know that this is highly reinforced by all this, my substantive value. But he's not allowed that because he's screened himself off from it. So the impasse is broken in favor of the identitarian, right? Because the identitarian, I mean, when I imagine myself to be not just a devout Muslim, but highly reinforced, right? And then if he says, you must choose this, but of course he's not allowed the reinforcement of it here, you must choose this, he's asking us to be weak-willed, right? Because that's how I've defined being weak-willed, which is something highly reinforced. So that identity, it's not just an impasse, the identitarian always wins. Right? If you're weak-willed, you're having your fifth martini and you're saying, I shouldn't, all your things are suggesting you should do this, but you don't do it. Right? If I drink my fifth martini, my health will fail, my job will be, I'll be fired from my job, my children will despise me, and so on and so forth. Right? All my other, I value my children, my job, etc. All that is there, and still I drink my fifth martini. You're addicted. Weak-willed is a form of addiction. So Rawls is basically asking us to be addicted to liberalism. What kind of a philosophy is that? Right? So the identitarian, alas, always wins. Now, here's something interesting. I'm going to stop in a minute. what's interesting here is that we have this, I think, a very strong intuition which we should resist. But I think we have it, that what Khomeini is doing is really pretty irrational. Right? That the liberal mentality, as I've been describing it, forget communitarian, the liberal mentality has rationality on its side. Right? I mean, after all, you think you might change your mind, and you said, no, damn it all, in the future, surely you should be living by the desires you have, the preferences you have. Isn't that rational? You'd think that. But before we congratulate the liberal too much on this count of being more intuitively rational, I would suggest that one shouldn't really pursue this line of thought too hard, because for all her liberal ideas here of revisability, fallibility, insurance policy for the future and so on, which seems intuitively rational, that's the declared ideology of the liberal. It's attractive ideology, but the liberal herself often goes against it. And I would suggest that the very concept of rights, which is so central to liberal thought, goes against liberalism's declared position here of taking out an insurance policy for it. Because ask yourself, what are rights? Rights are supposed to be different from other values we have. Right? We have all sorts of values, then we elevate some of them into some fundamental status in the Constitution or something, call them rights, and give them a fundamental status. What is an essential element in doing so, in this elevation? It is to tie yourself to the mast. Right? Take free speech. Suppose I am deeply committed to free speech as liberals are, and I say, it's not like other values, I want to elevate it and make it a right. Well, one of the things you do when you elevate and make it a right is to say that were I to weaken and find some distasteful person coming around trying to propagandize in favor of, I don't know, Hindu majoritarianism or something, I should prevent him from speaking. Well, if I have the instinct to prevent him from speaking, I should be tying myself to the mast and not live by that instinct. That's what it is to make speech right. So before we find it too intuitively rational to take the side of the insurance policy for the future, we ought to reconsider it, because if it is irrational, if Khomeini is irrational, then so is the liberal who believes in rights. Okay, thanks very much. I'm sorry I've done
larger social change. And how different is the argument from Marx when he says, that social change ultimately is going to be class conflict? And what you are saying are identities here can be taken as, classes with...
Did I hear the word Marx?
I'm saying, how different is your argument from Marx, where he says that larger social change is going to be a result of conflict of classes? Because I think what you are talking in terms of identities here can be taken as different classes which have vested interests, out of which they can decide their identities and decide to live by them. Are you getting my question?
Say that again. I'm not hearing you properly. Here's a microphone.
Okay, I'll stand up and say. I'm saying, going by a line of reason and extrapolating your reason to say larger social change. I mean, is your argument any different from Marx when he says that social change which will take place in a society is ultimately going to be a result of conflicts between different classes? Because what you are saying are identities here can be constituted as classes with different vested interests. No. And to maintain those interests or retain them can be taken as living by those identities. And it will be difficult to bring change in a society unless one of these classes is, say, decisively defeated or wins. Because if Khomeini Khomeini was opposed to modernity. I mean, there's absolutely no way you can bring modernity in Iran without exterminating Khomeini, because Khomeini is not about Khomeini. Khomeini is about the entire Iran given his political power.
No, wait a minute. Khomeini might change his mind and become a modern man.
Well, but Khomeini has a vested interest in not changing his mind.
Oh, you mean the Khomeini, the identitarian?
Maybe. I mean,
Yeah,
suppose
okay,
I am a manual scavenger in India, and the government should be doing policies to get rid of manual scavenging. But there are people who save a hell lot of money because manual scavenging still persists. So it is against the government's interest to spend so much money and to get rid of manual scavenging.
But that sounds as if it's against people's interests and so on. That isn't the kind
But
of...
the entire idea of liberalism is that my interest will not come in conflict with your interest.
So let's work with an example, okay? So Marx's idea is, let's work with an example. So let's take, shall we take the proletariat, the working class, and finish the thought?
Let us take a colonizer and a colonized. Say, I am a British and I have colonized India.
Okay.
And I should not be repressing people. No.
I should not be, the British person says...
The British should not be repressing an Indian or say exploiting him.
Who says this? The Indian says this. I'm
Yeah.
talking about...
Let us say the Indian says this.
Okay.
But if the British does not do it, and he is not going to make money and doing what he is doing here in the first place.
You're not going to be employed? Who's not going to...
And you have colonized India with a purpose.
Yes.
To be able to make money.
Oh, to make...
Stop repressing the Indians. You're not going to... So it's a question of survival for the colonizer as well, as much it is for the colonized.
Okay, so the colonizer says, what exactly? I don't want to weaken because I might become an anti-imperialist in the future? Just mimic what I said in your example. So the colonizer says, I should protect myself from becoming...
So suppose the British is the colonizer and the Indian is the colonized.
Yes.
And the Indian today is saying that you should not be doing what you're doing to me when you have colonized me.
Yes.
Suppose, say, expropriating England. And liberalism would say that, the colonizer would say that, maybe because I've been wrong in the past, I may be wrong right now, so I listen to the Indian. That is what liberalism says, right?
That's what Mill says.
But if the British does that, then he cannot no longer maintain his colony.
Okay, but I see. So you're saying if the British were genuine liberals, they would hold the imperialist convictions with a certain amount of diffidence and so on. And the fact that they don't is a sign that they are identitarians, they've got imperialist identity. No, you see, you're not joining me. I mean, I want you to...
I'm trying to say that what you call as identity, in the largest, because we are talking about individuals here, in the larger social picture can be constituted as a group of people
Yes, absolutely.
who have an interest which is distinctly contradictory to, say, the interest of other group of people. And which is will lead to shaping up their identity. Because identities are not abstract terms. There's a material basis to formation of my or your identity.
No, okay, so, I mean, if you're talking about the material basis for it, it has to come into the mentality before it joins my argument. It has to come within the mentality, see, because I'm really looking at a class of mentalities, right? So what you're calling about the material determining elements would have to enter into the rationalizations before it joins the argument.
Maybe I'll think about it for some time.
I mean, the fact is, it's a very good question how the British could square, or Europeans generally, post-Enlightenment Europeans could square colonization with their liberal principles. It's a perfectly good question, but all it shows is that liberals never ever thought that their justifications, their mentalistic justifications of empire which were basically paternalistic justifications, right? Quite apart from the material, which are basically paternalistic justifications. I think liberals never took paternalism to be at odds with liberal principles. They never took paternalism. Now, they maybe have been wrong in that, but I don't believe they thought it clashed with liberal principles. Yeah, lots of hands. Yeah.
Well, so I just didn't get why your argument isn't smuggling back in the substantive values into behind the veil. So I didn't get, I think I might have missed it, but why, if I'm allowed to have identitarian preferences behind the veil, that's not sort of doing what Rawls says we can't do and putting the substantive values again behind the veil, because I have a commitment to a particular set of preferences.
No. Remember, behind the veil of ignorance, I can imagine anything I like. In fact, I must imagine all possible things, per impossible. The idea is that no matter what I imagine myself to be, I would choose this principle. That's the risk-averse strategy. So I imagine myself
but it's
not...
like my ex post, it's like given any identitarian preferences that I could have after the veil is lifted, what institutions would I commit to?
Right. The instruction is, no matter what I imagine myself to be, when the veil is lifted, I would still be happy with these principles, etc. Still believe. That's the idea. Otherwise, they'd be gambling.
Okay. So I guess I'm just not sure how then where's the contradiction between the identitarian logic and the liberal logic? Because it's like it seems like you were making an analogy for allowing for identitarian preferences behind the veil, because you were saying that I couldn't.
Yeah. Remember, the instruction is, I could be a Muslim, I could be a Christian, I could be a socialist, I could be... Still choose liberty, still choose liberty, still choose liberty. That's the idea.
Oh, I think it's more like I think it's like, I could randomly be any identity. Given I don't know what identity I'm going to be, I should stick with liberal principles because I don't know what identity I'm going to be.
Well, that could be a way of summarizing a whole lot of things, but the breakdown would be, if I imagine this, I would still be. If I imagine this, it would still be.
Yeah.
But
that's
it would
like
be...
the extreme risk, yeah. I see.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to respond directly to your interesting remark about the absence of any clear recognition at the beginning of the contradiction between paternalism, as it was practiced, for example, or as it was used to justify imperialism, and liberalism. I think that there were plenty of Enlightenment figures who did see that contradiction, and there are funny quips about how, well, it has to be that blacks are inferior, because if blacks are inferior, then I'm not a Christian.
Absolutely right. There's a lot of hypocrisy too.
So I think it's widely recognized. Nicholas Dirks has a book on this.
Who?
Nicholas Dirks has in your school. I think it might be your dean.
Actually, he's defected to another school.
Oh, he has defected. I see. Well, I did. He was your dean. He did write a book on this theme, and the trial of Hastings is where he says emerged in a very public way this notion of those who were colonized needing a paternalistic figure, as they would have outcomes even worse than the Bengali famine and all the other bad outcomes of colonialism, and that it was basically hypocritical. It wasn't really seriously believed, but it took root, and it may well be the root. Certainly, many American historians believe it's the root of racism.
Absolutely.
It's the root.
Absolutely. The philosopher Carol Rowan has studied American slave owner racism in some detail, and she's found an absolutely gorgeous example of your of just the point, excellent point you're making. Slave owners said that Negroes, as they call them, did not possess rationality. They were ineducable. It was just a basic. And she finds in other documents that they say, so they're ineducable. in other documents you find saying, we mustn't educate them, it would be dangerous. If it's dangerous to educate them, then they're educable. Right? So there's so much slippage in which the hypocrisy shows. Yeah, so of course there's overt rationalization, and then there's, I guess this is what people must mean by deconstruction, right? You just deconstruct your overt things with these slippages and so on. This is what,
why should the liberal argue that my submission to the desire to change my values or beliefs is actually strength rather than weakness?
the desire not to change.
No, yeah, but when you said that, you may eventually end up changing yourself and maybe acquiring an identity which you wish to. But that would be, for the liberals, it would be like, okay, this is my strength, that I will be able to do whatever I want to without, without affecting any other individual. I don't understand that why that's necessarily a weak-willed behavior.
Oh, my idea was, you've got an impasse. You're with me up to the impasse? Okay. And now, my thought was, the impasse is, given the framework, conceptual framework, the sort of theoretical framework, the impasse seems to always favor, to be broken in favor of the non-liberal, because the non-liberal can imagine the commitment, say to Islam or whatever, as being highly fortified in the sense that I define. See, my point of introducing this was to say that it's very fortified, and then if one chooses liberalism, if one's Islamism is highly fortified, and one chooses liberalism, then one is weak-willed, right? Because I define weak-will as the highly reinforced values suggest you should do this, but you do something else. So if you choose liberalism, as Rawls asks you to, even though you imagine yourself to be not only a Muslim, but a Muslim whose values are highly reinforced by his other values, then you would have been weak-willed by the way I've set things up. And that's what I'm saying, is it goes beyond the impasse. Look, I'm giving you a completely descriptive analysis. I'm not taking any normative sides on this, right? I'm not saying, but I'm just saying the way things have been set up in these frameworks, it looks bad for the liberal. So we've got a lot of work to do. I am a liberal, but we've just got a lot of work to do.
That's not satisfying.
Wait a minute. You can't say this is irrational, but I'm going for it.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Maybe in English departments, but not in philosophy.
Question back. Okay, I just want to ask you whether, subsequent to theory of justice, the political liberalism, where Rawls brings in other kinds of pragmatic considerations. You mentioned one,
yes,
that he's saying that, look, I'm not talking about a universal conception of justice, but a political conception, where you smuggle in a lot of other elements. That's one. Second,
you're absolutely right that the work gets more and more baroque, and there's this endless Rawlsian minutiae in the secondary literature. But he, even in the Law of Peoples, even in his very late work, he never gave up the original position. Right. Now, what I'm saying is that if you think things through and come up with a different form of liberalism, you simply cannot retain, as Rawls does right till the end, the original position. The original position is redundant. I myself believe that there are things in Rawls which make the original position completely redundant. But that's not how he thought of it at all. And the stuff which makes it redundant is pretty half-baked, I mean, it's writing at the end of his life. And so I think there's a hell of a lot of sorting out to do here before liberalism gets different. It's not really been done by other people. Charles Taylor's tried and so on, but There's a lot of work to be done here.
But Akeel, let's say a liberal tells you or tells us that, look, we live in a plural society, and weakness of will that you talk about is, after all, in certain contexts, not a bad idea. To sustain the idea of a plural society. Sometimes, for example, I hate somebody saying something, I won't feel like killing this guy, but I think it's right that I have weakness of will.
No,
and that's possible, and in the sense that that's the reason why you want to tolerate the intolerable. And that makes the liberal society.
If you hate somebody and so on, you see, it has to come out so that it's rational by your own lines. I think everything is lost if you're not even rational by your own lines. I mean, if you're not even rational by your own lights, the game is up. Only literary people exalted that.
So maybe there's a second order evaluation. You say that, no, but Akeel, you might say that, look, it's not rational, but on the second order evaluation, I might say that, look, I cannot go whole hog.
Okay, but then if you don't do that, then you've got to make it clear to what extent you're buying into this whole framework. I'm happy to abandon the framework, right? I'm happy to abandon the framework, but I think if you abandon it, what you've got to abandon is something that Rawls retained till the end of his intellectual life. And as I said, there are passages in Rawls in which, if you really believed it, it would make completely redundant this whole apparatus which he retains. I mean, I think it's the second chapter of Law of Peoples. It's all in place. Yes.
So this is not really a question. I'm just trying to think through what you from your talk. Between liberalism and identitarian arguments, it seems like one set of ideas are presented as if it's the natural instinct of man. For instance, non-interference or liberty, the idea of liberty. While the other set of values, say substantive values, look like they are derived from something like accumulated traditions or cultures and so on.
But then the first one is natural instinct?
Something like, why would Rawls say that no
it's
matter
probably very cultivated instinct, no?
Why would Rawls argue that under any condition you would choose liberty, because you would naturally choose liberty no matter what, because so I'm trying to think about it like this, that the liberalism or liberal values need not be justified because they are in fact the natural instinct of man, while traditionally or culturally derived values need to be justified, I don't know why, but so the justification required from substantive values is a justification that liberalism asks to these values. And that's, liberalism has not demanded that justification from itself. Now if you go to the communitarian arguments or the communitarian critiques of liberalism, they say, okay, see, liberal values are too universal, and whereas people live also by values that they have acquired through where they live. But the point there is that liberal values are not universal. They are presented as if they are instinctual, but they are in fact something like
But that's perfectly compatible with this, right? You and I, stepping back and giving a detached intellectual history of liberalism, can say all this arose in a certain period of history, no doubt because of the presence of certain economic formations in which certain values surfaced, and so on and so forth. So we could give, as it were, an ethnography, as intellectual historians sometimes do, an ethnography of conceptual development. We can do that. And point out that this only surfaced. In fact, I think it only surfaced with if you really want to know what I think it only surfaced at the time when you needed a justification for the enclosures. But that's a very long story. You're absolutely right. One can give a detailed story of that kind. But nevertheless, one could say that in that period of history, for these genealogical reasons, there came to be a view which required this to be supported by nothing of this kind, but by arguments of the mill rolls, etc. kind. That's perfectly compatible. Yeah. Yeah.
Will you call externalities as reinforcement? Will you call externalities as reinforcement?
What sorts of externalities?
Like in the particular example you gave, you did philosophy. Your father's happy. Your father's happy, so you fulfill your second desire.
So you did what?
Your father's happy, so your second desire was to make your father happy.
No, you see, it's a good point. You see, I'm interested in reason and psychology, as what philosophers call moral psychology. So I'm not interested in the fact that my desire to please my father and my desire to do philosophy, in fact, one was a means to the other. It wasn't a means to the other in my psychological economy. That's the point. Rationality has to do with one's states of mind, right? Which, as it were, by the lights of, it's got to be within one's intentionality. There could be means and relations which are not what I intend at all. That's of no interest to rationality. It just happens to be the case that I'm a relatively harmonious subject. But it's not as if I do one in order to do the other. That's where the means and rationality comes in.
But then if you end up doing the other, then how can there be a weakness of will?
But wait, I'm saying that it's the Muslim who imagines himself to be reinforced. He's not the one who's weak-willed in my argument. Yeah.
So, as a liberal, from my own point of view, as a liberal, why am I weak-willed if I say that the highest principle of my creed is non-interference? Come what may, I will live by non-interference. Why am I weak-willed then from my point of view? I'm being seen as weak-willed from an identitarian point of view.
No, you're not weak-willed from an identitarian point of view. You're weak-willed from a point of view which is exercised within a framework in which you're trying to argue for liberal principles without basing them on variably held values.
On very?
Variably held values.
I didn't get the last
word. The idea is that when you declare yourself, no matter what, etc., etc., good. But what liberalism says is that declaration is a declaration that cannot get its ground on some things like that. If it doesn't get its ground on things like that, then you have something like the contractual scenario in Rawls or something like that. Within that scenario, right, you're asked to imagine no matter what, etc. You imagine yourself to be and. Then, if you still choose this under that scenario, then I'm saying you're weak-willed. I'm not interested in your declaration that you bloody well want free speech no matter what. If you want it under these conditions, etc., which is what gives you a liberal polity. Right? It's not declaring your instincts, it's a liberal polity that we're interested in. Yeah.
So let me push, I think I probably get the structure here. So let's think about this for the difference principle. And so then again, let's say, behind the veil you're like, fine, difference principle. But then after the veil you find yourself really poor. And you're like, why not? Wouldn't I tear down this architecture and redistribute everything to myself? And then basically for me not to act on that would be like sort of weak will because I need to consider all possible. I need to consider what I would do in the event of being really poor after the veil is lifted. And so I'm wondering if there's like an analog to your argument.
For the maximum?
For the maximum, yeah.
I haven't thought of that. I mean, I just haven't pursued it.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll think about that. I mean, I should have. Yeah, good project. Have you done a PhD yet?
I'm your colleague.
I'm just kidding. Shashika.
So in this reformulation of, let's say, the older conflict in somewhat radically new ways, where you put it as, say, the conflict gets formulated as a deep commitment to T1, difference in the present, in the identitarian, and in the future, in the case of the one who holds to liberal values. What if one were to ask you whether it's possible to perform an Hegelian task of saying, then what is it that is generating a common irrationality? What is it? Because the crux of the argument has been to show up, in some sense, the irrationality that is at the core of liberalism. We're so used to the irrationality of the Khomeini types. If one were to
What's the irrationality? I think Khomeini is every bit as rational as the person who believes in rights.
Right. So you're saying that in both cases it's a rational thing, and I
mean, I should put it more cautiously. In both things, it's as rational or irrational as the other. I mean, you just have to be cautious here. I mean, I really am not taking a stand on any of this normatively. I'm just giving you a descriptive analysis of this and saying what the really hard issues are, which I think are harder than the communitarian issues. And I mean, they're less titillating than the communitarian issues. You know, if you have a glow about being a community and so on, that's neither here nor there. This is just a more rigorous problem. But I want to put it very cautiously. I want to say it is no more irrational than the liberal is, to the extent that the liberal believes in free speech being separate from other values in some sense. You know, I mean, Dawkins calls it trumps. They're just different ways in which to develop it. Yeah.
Someone said.
No, go ahead. I just said there should be one thought to ask.
Okay. Someone said that it's inconceivable to think of a liberal position outside of a market economy. That in a world where I can't just go out and buy food and obtain employment individually.
That's a very
market. But everything is based on cooperation in the household and the village. Life depends on that. Then liberalism wouldn't even occur to me. It would make no sense.
Well, you know, this is a wonderfully it's a very hard question, and what it really shows, I mean, if one probes it, you know, this is perfectly simple but very deep-going issue here, that it is an extraordinary thing. It's the simplest, obvious point, and just see how deep it goes. As soon as liberty was formulated in the modern West, I mean, I'm not talking about Periclean Athens, I'm not talking about Greek notions of liberty, which are in some ways maybe more complicated. But when it was formulated, let's say in the period leading up to the great transformations of the French Revolution, as soon as they were formulated, they were theorized in such a way that they were at odds with the other formulated idea of equality. It's it's such a simple, obvious thing. It's fantastically perverse. Imagine an outlook, a political outlook, formulating an idea and immediately theorizing it in such a way that it is impossible to realize with the other articulation. I mean, you have to be really perverse, and you can only come to understand this if you understand the kinds of things you're saying. right? That it emerged in a certain context, which you were also saying. And it emerged in a certain context and so on, and there were compulsions to theorize it. Look, property, the liberty that attaches or is bestowed on one by the possession of property is just one aspect which leads to inequalities. Just think of the liberty that attaches to talent. Think of the incentivization of talent. It's just astonishing how early this was tied up with liberty. Right? I mean, the idea is that if I had talent, I have a right to reap the rewards of it. A right. Desert. Right gets attached to desert. This happens very early on. You know, at the beginning they distinguished between labor and talent. Labor was what everybody possessed, talent was unequally distributed. As soon as the notion of self-governance came about in the idea of liberty, gone. Right? So you were allowed to, it was a right to reap the fruits of liberty. Just think of the inequalities. Right? Just think of it. And think how deep it goes. I mean, you're considered a hysterical egalitarian ideologue if you think talent should not be incentivized. I mean, think of it. Sachin Tendulkar can't make billions, or whatever, hundreds of thousands. How much has he made? It's extraordinary. You know, and the bonuses. You remember the outcry after the financial crisis, and we should stop these bonuses and so on. And the answer was, if you stop the bonuses, we lose our talent.
Well, there was a response to that from Joe with his talk on Tuesday, I think, that it's not possible, it's just math.
It's just what?
It's the ability to extract resources from
The ideology
power.
Yeah, or if it is talent, then I would have thought that the equally good response is, well, if talent got us into the mess, let's have mediocrity. Right? So it's a dilemma. Either it isn't talent, or it is talent. And if it is talent, we should not want it. But look, the idea of a right, I mean, I'm just supporting what you're saying. You see, if you did not but think how deep it goes, probably you and I believe it too. If you were not to praise and reward talent, who would you be praising, individual talent? Who would you be praising and rewarding? The zeitgeist? It's very hard. So, you know, these things just have to be, you have to step back and think hard about these things philosophically. And I think it's a wonderful challenge to try and show what it would take. I don't believe you can do it within the framework of the Enlightenment, political enlightenment. It's impossible to make liberty and equality compatible. I mean, I think you would change the meanings of the terms if you were to make them compatible. They would no more mean the same thing.
We need a new framework, there's no question.
Yeah. I mean, it's like mass doesn't mean the same thing in Newtonian mechanics as it does in Einstein's physics. It's, you know, it would just be a paradigm shift.
Thank you.